We had a separate video before about terrestrial biomes. Now I'd like to talk about the aquatic ones. And I think this one could be a little bit faster because there's just a few things I need to add. However, I should have put wetlands into terrestrial because technically wetland is land, which is occasionally wet. You can see in this slide that wetlands are scattered all over the world. So they really don't have a single climatograph. If you'll consider, this one is basically the opposite of this climatograph. Basically every temperature is possible, and wetlands are available basically all over the planet. So the map and the climatograph was not a good fit for this biome. Wetlands occur everywhere, any land which is occasionally wet. So, you know, like the Goleta Slough, the Santa Barbara Airport, like low places on the high school campus that sometimes get all muddy and wet, that's a wetland. And these turn out to be ecologically super critical because, you know, they're places where water ends up. And so that water carries nutrients and material from one place into a new environment where, you know, you've got a lot of sunlight, water, nutrients. That's going to be super productive. And productive pockets of water are really important for migrating birds and to breed aquatic life. Wetlands also work as a sponge. You should write that down, the sponge effect. We'll talk more about wetlands later in the unit. Later in this course. But you should know super productive, migration, important for aquatic life, and the sponge effect, which means that running water soaks in like a sponge and then trickles out over an extended period like a sponge. So wetlands work to slow and moderate runoff. Because there's all that life, they also help digest and break down waste. And, you know, like a sponge, all the water comes out eventually, but if it trickles out slowly, that can also recharge groundwater. All these benefits to wetlands. Leave it somewhere in your notes, ultra critical to wildlife, and we are going to come back later to talk about all of those things I just listed. Freshwaters are all over the planet. So again, the climatograph is probably a low blow. I have a bitchin' map in my classroom that shows you, you know, like this stuff, but all the planet's freshwaters. And it looks just like those diagrams you've seen of a circulatory system in humans. You ever seen that where you get like a person and then it just shows all of their veins and arteries? So imagine how much fresh water is moving around on our planet, just all over the surface, all the lakes and all the rivers and all the ponds and streams and stuff. So what I would like you to add is that freshwaters are the planet's circulatory system. They move everything around on the planet. I want you to also add into your notes that all pollution becomes water pollution. So air pollution mixes with water and becomes water pollution. Anything you throw on the ground gets washed away into the water somewhere. So circulatory system is also kind of where all of our pollution gets spread around. Finally, please write in your notes that freshwater is exceedingly rare. Almost all the water on the planet is in the ocean, but there is some fresh water which is almost all frozen. And there is a little tiny bit of fresh water which is not frozen, but that's almost all underground in groundwater. And so the actual water on our planet, which is not salt, not frozen, and not in the ground, is something like 0.003% or something. Fresh water is extremely rare. We'll talk more about this in the water unit. Estuaries are places where freshwater and saltwater meet. Again, this happens all over the planet. Again, the climatograph is not a good idea because, of course, estuaries are found all over the planet. Now, what I would like you to know is that these are extremely dynamic. Part of the day it's saltwater because high tide, part of the day it's freshwater because low tide, right? Like if you go to your favorite beach and look for where the water's going out, at high tide, you'll see the ocean water going into the estuary, but at low tide, you'll see water spilling out of the estuary. So estuaries are super dynamic. They are sometimes salty, sometimes fresh, sometimes hot because sunlight is warming fresh water, and they're sometimes cold because the water rushes in from the ocean. As a matter of fact, estuaries are a perfect example of two vocab terms. Estuaries are an ecotone, a place where two biomes overlap. Freshwater and saltwater biome overlap at the estuary. Where a river flows out into the ocean, you've got both biomes kind of blurring together. That's called an ecotone. And you can imagine that in this place, you've got all the freshwater diversity plus all the saltwater diversity together. So at the ecotone, you have greater biodiversity. That's called the edge effect. The edge effect says that biodiversity is greater where two biomes overlap. That's called an ecotone, is the place where two biomes overlap, and the edge effect is the idea that diversity is greater. So that's why estuaries are such a big whoop. They've got all the freshwater diversity plus all the saltwater diversity. And you might be able to imagine, if you've got freshwater and saltwater stuff, then you're probably going to get the birds that like freshwater plus the birds that like saltwater overlapping. So now you've got the animals which hunt fresh birds plus the animals which hunt salty birds. And so there's just this like confluence of life. This is why all the bird watching nerds always go to estuaries, by the way, like the Goleta Slough or over by the Goleta Airport or the Pit Arroyo Burro or the Bird Refuge down by the zoo or whatever. Estuaries are a hotspot for bird watching because of that confluence of biomes, which also has greater diversity. Coral reefs are basically the tropical rainforest of the ocean. So here you do need a climatograph because these are tropical only. Coral reefs also tend to be shallow. There's a few exceptions, but they're almost always warm, shallow, tropical water. And something which is kind of shocking is that they are not super productive. Hot water doesn't have a lot of dissolved nutrients. So they're not super productive, but what they are is they're super consistent, right? 12 hours of sunlight every single day, no seasons, so no change in water chemistry. So like a tropical rainforest, you have a ton of diversification. You have a bazillion specialized species. So what's important for you to note about coral reef is that they're super consistent. They're low productivity. That's a surprise because the water is hot, productivity is low. But they have tremendous biodiversity because of the consistency. You have a bunch of specialized micro niches. And check it out, two kids found the same diagram. Okay, so temperate coastal marine is where you live. It's the green in this map. And this is actually super productive. These are globally some of the most productive oceans year in and year out. So over the course of the entire year, these are the most productive oceans. That's where you and I live. So I was hoping somebody would, yeah, there we go. There's the kelp. Temperate coastal marine is where you find kelp. And cold water sucks for you and me because we're mammals, but cold water has more dissolved nutrients. And what that means is that these are super productive, extremely high dissolved oxygen, so they have a whole bunch of microbes. And you know, because the water's cold, there's more nutrients, so stuff just grows faster. The fastest growing thing on Earth of all life on our planet is the giant kelp that grows right here. As much as 2 feet a day, you can literally sit in a class and watch kelp grow. I've done it many, many times. If you stand next to an aquarium, which has cold ocean water and kelp with plenty of sunlight, you'll see where the kelp is. You can mark it with a little marker. We did this in the lab. And then you sit there and you talk for your stupid 1-hour meeting, and then you look to the right and the kelp is now grown. More than an inch per hour, sometimes 2 inches per hour. That's a lot. So these are the most productive plants, or sorry, the most productive producers. And so there's a whole bunch of little bugs that eat them, and there's a whole bunch of little fish that eat those, and there's a big fish that eat them. So technically, these temperate, remember temperate, like 30 to 60, temperate coastal marine ecosystems also tend to have the most rich fisheries. Now, fisheries have been hammered. Globally, we're basically out of seafood. It doesn't feel that way because we keep finding new, further, deeper places to get the seafood, but the historically most productive oceans have mostly been tapped. Which is why you're stoked to live in Santa Barbara. This is the epicenter of environmental science, and your local university, UCS Brodog, has the Marine Science Institute and the Bren School of Environmental Science, which is run by my friend Steve Gaines. And Steve Gaines has written a number of fascinating research projects about how to best manage fisheries within temperate coastal marine ecosystems. And you probably never knew this, but our Santa Barbara Harbor is kind of the bullseye for the most thoughtful environmental conservation work to preserve ocean ecosystems. A lot of interesting stuff goes on here, and there's a lot of fighting. And you might know that I'm a commercial fisherman, so I truly do like both sides of this conversation. But anyway, I digress. Super productive, interesting fisheries. Cold water is better for sea life. Now, Arctic coastline, you might think is so cold, that's got to be awesome, right? But don't forget it's so cold and it's also winter sometimes. So the Arctic coastline is cold and full of nutrients, but in the dark during the Arctic winter. Then imagine the flip side. The most productive season in the ocean is the Arctic coast in Arctic summer, right? Because those are really long days. Like, as a matter of fact, you can get into this stretch where it'll go 30 days with no darkness, meaning that this is extremely cold, so a lot of dissolved nutrients, and the sun never sets. So there are these tremendous blooms of life for a few months. So all the plankton populations explode, and all the whales show up, and all the little fish show up, and all the salmon come to eat the little fish, and all the orcas come to eat the salmon, and all the sea lions, and it's just amazing. I'd like you to note, most productive seasonally, but of course the extreme seasonal opposite, they also have the biggest belly flop. It's completely lifeless in the winter, just like we were talking about the polar regions at the start of the previous slideshow. I think this is our last aquatic biome. I hope I'm not mistaken. Yeah, this is our last aquatic biome. Um, there's so much to say about the ocean. Humans are changing it because it's getting hotter. And a hotter ocean is a bigger ocean, and our land masses are shifting. So we have sea level rise, and it's different in different places. Some places have a lot of sea level rise, some places have a little bit of sea level rise. The ocean is also becoming more acidic because carbon dioxide that we've added to the air is dissolving into the ocean to make more carbonic acid. So, like the stuff that makes your soda eat your teeth, carbonic acid, carbonation, bubble, fizzy, LaCroix, bad for your teeth because carbonic acid. Same thing happens in the ocean. All the things with a shell are all getting fizzed like your teeth when you drink too many LaCroix. Um, of course, like I mentioned, fisheries are in a global collapse. All of our trash keeps piling into the ocean. Um, the ocean is like a really sad story. It's the source of most of our protein. It is the number one source of food for the planet. It's the number one reservoir for total biodiversity. It's the largest reservoir of carbon, and we're heating it up, acidifying it, robbing it of all of its life, and dumping all of our waste into it. Oh my God. There are so many things that we could talk about. But I probably won't say nearly enough in this class. I am an oceanographer. I have a big interest in oceanography. I have a lot to tell you, but in our course, those are kind of the only things that you really need to know about. We'll talk later about fisheries. We'll talk later about how it's getting hotter and changing sea level. We'll talk later about how it's getting more acidic. And we'll talk later about how it's getting full of trash. And there's so much to say about these things, but for now, just make sure you know those four. And we'll call it another lecture on biomes. I guess that's it. Bye.